July of 1892 brought forth one of the bloodiest collective labor confrontations in United States history. At this time, we were at the height of the Industrial Revolution. The United States had an insatiable demand for steel, and at the ready to feed this demand were Andrew Carnegie and his Carnegie Steel Empire. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland and immigrated to the United States as a teenager. Carnegie came from very humble beginnings, but he was an extraordinary business person. Through many well-timed and aggressive decisions, he was able to amass a steel conglomerate that controlled all of the elements needed for steel production. At one point, Andrew Carnegie was widely recognized as the wealthiest man on the planet. This wealth did not come by accident. He was a ruthless business person who often exploited labor in an effort to extract more profit. Homestead, Pennsylvania was the site of the labor conflict of 1892. Carnegie Steel was in disagreement with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers over wages at the Homestead Steelworks plant. Their labor contract was set to expire, and they needed to come to an agreement. The public disagreement revolved around the wage scale for employees. However, the true and underlying reason for the conflict was Carnegie's deep disdain for collective bargaining. He resented any union interference to the operation of his company. He built Carnegie Steel, and he saw it as his right to run it unilaterally. Carnegie ruled with an iron fist and was willing to do anything and everything in his power to defeat the unions. Up to this point, he had successfully thwarted union recognition at every one of his steel mills except the Homestead Steelworks. While his intentions are now well known, he was very conscious of public opinion. He did not want to appear to be a strikebreaker or enemy of labor, and instead pretended to be a champion for labor rights. Carnegie was able to successfully forward his personal agenda while shielding himself from public scrutiny by having his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, impose his will. Frick and Carnegie had much in common. Frick, too, had come from humble beginnings. He had amassed a sizable fortune through heavy-handed management tactics. He used the same management philosophy with the union, and Carnegie was content to avoid the spotlight in the Homestead matter. Rather than wage a public war, Frick offered a deal that he knew labor could not accept. He bargained in bad faith by offering labor contracts that paid less in spite of ongoing increases to Carnegie Steel profitability. He argued that wages should go down when steel prices fall and rise when steel prices increased. Since wages were already low, workers had little incentive to accept his terms. As anticipated, negotiations broke down and Frick prepared for battle with the union. Frick ordered the construction of a 3-mile fortification to the perimeter of the Homestead Steelworks by building a 12-foot wooden fence around the facility. He even equipped it with barbed wire and an observation deck. It was more akin to a prison than a steel mill. The fortification caused the workers to nickname the facility Fort Frick. Henry Clay Frick preempted the eventual strike by shutting down the entire mill and locking out all 3,800 workers. In spite of this, union members held a vote and unanimously decided to reject Frick's last proposal and go on strike. The workers anticipated trouble from Frick in the form of union busters. Under the direction of strike leader Hugh O'Donnell, they set up patrols to search for and thwart approaching replacement workers or strikebreakers. They patrolled the Monongahela River in search of incoming parties, since they knew that it was the easiest way to move large quantities of people into town undetected. In addition to being a union member, Hugh O'Donnell was a first-generation Irish immigrant who worked in the mills. O'Donnell was clear that he wanted a peaceful strike, but he warned that scabs would be firmly prevented from entering the mill. Frick reached out to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the largest private security force in the country, for assistance. At one point, it was estimated that there were more Pinkerton detectives than U.S. Army soldiers. Frick wanted the Pinkertons to protect the scabs that he planned to bring in. On July 6, Frick arranged to bring in 2 barges full of Pinkerton agents down the Monongahela River. His goal was to secure the plant and the dock that led to the plant. Once they had secured both, he believed that he could safely bring in replacement workers via the same means. While Frick believed that he could secretly bring in the barges under the cover of darkness, the workers were prepared. Their patrol spotted the Pinkertons as they came up the river and quickly arranged to confront the detectives at the dock. The Union seized the mill by knocking down the fence and rushed to meet the Pinkertons at the foot of the river. As word quickly spread about the incoming forces, the mass of Homestead residents converged upon the river, and their numbers swelled to almost 10,000 men and women. They came armed with any and every type of weapon they could find. As the barges landed, Hugh O'Donnell met the Pinkertons to implore them to retreat. The angry mob grew louder and louder, and O'Donnell knew that there would be bloodshed. He wanted to do everything in his power to avert it. As the Pinkertons began to disembark the barge, a shot was fired. To this day, nobody is entirely sure of who fired that first fateful shot. A melee ensued and chaos took over. Shots rang in from all directions for over 10 minutes. The workers were determined to sink the barges and stop the Pinkertons. They soaked the raft with oil and lit it on fire before they floated it down the river in hopes of igniting one of the barges. They then loaded a rail car with dynamite and rolled it down the hill in hopes of earning a direct strike. They also loaded an old cannon with scrap steel and fired it in the direction of the barges. This effort was not very well coordinated because the cannon inadvertently struck one of the workers as it fired and missed wildly. As both sides suffered losses, they collected themselves to press on. The tugboat that had pulled the barges up the river was loaded with injured Pinkertons and abandoned the remaining detectives in the barges at the end of the river. Stranded and outnumbered, the agents grew increasingly worried and scared. At one point, they presented a white flag at the entrance of the barge, only to have it greeted with more bullets. After 12 more hours of battle, surrender was finally negotiated. The workers promised the Pinkertons that no further harm would come to them. The Pinkertons were unloaded from the barge and led into town. The residents of Homestead lined the 600-yard path on both sides and welcomed the agents with further hostility. The agents were heckled, punched, and kicked all the way into Homestead. They were battered with sticks and stones on their gruesome march through town. They asked for mercy, but the residents were angry and beat them further instead. The tattered and defeated Pinkertons were loaded onto a train and sent out of town. On this same day, the workers set fire to the barges that lay abandoned at the foot of the Monongahela River. In the days after the confrontation, the workers viewed the battle as a victory to their efforts. In their triumph, they rebuilt the wall around the mill and staffed the observation deck to guard against further threats from Frick. They were optimistic that they would emerge victorious in their standoff against Carnegie and Frick. The events that transpired at Homestead were published in newspapers around the country. Public support was divided in both directions. Some were sympathetic to the strife of the workers, while others viewed them as a lawless mob of criminals. When Carnegie received word of what had transpired, he cabled Frick to tell him that he should remain steadfast in his fight and never employ any of the strikers again. He was committed to his victory against the Union and was willing to keep the steel mill at a standstill rather than yield to the Union. Mayor John McLuckie contacted Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattison to communicate that order was being maintained in town. Carnegie also contacted the governor and exerted considerable political pressure on him to act and remove the strikers from the mill. Governor Pattison found that he had little choice than to acquiesce to Carnegie's demands. On July 12th, 8,500 state militia soldiers arrived in Homestead to enact martial law. They recouped control of the mill and enabled Carnegie to bring in scabs to run the Homestead steelworks. Over the ensuing months, the Union worked desperately to maintain solidarity. In time, charges were filed against the union leaders for their participation in the conflict. They were charged with conspiracy and murder for the death of the Pinkerton agents. In just 4 short months, the union started to crumble under financial demands. Union members began to cross picket lines and attempt to get their jobs back. Unfortunately, most of the workers were blacklisted by Frick and were unable to return to their former jobs. They found that scabs that were eager to take their jobs had easily replaced them. The straw that broke the camel's back came in the form of one Alexander Berkman, an anarchist who traveled to Pittsburgh to assassinate Frick on a misguided effort to support the Union. It's worth noting that Berkman's ideology was in striking contrast to that of the Union. They did not invite him to Homestead, nor were they aware of his nefarious plans. Berkman made his way to Frick's office and fired upon him at point-blank range. Berkman had never fired a gun before and failed miserably in his conquest. Frick endured a flesh wound to the neck and recovered in time to return to work the following week. While some were pleased to hear of Frick's injury, by and far, the public backlash was negative. The average American had no idea whether Berkman had acted alone or not. This act effectively nullified any remaining public support for the Union. The remaining strikers voted to return to work and join those who had already crossed the picket lines. By 1893, the majority of the strikers had been rehired on Frick's wage terms. The Union had been defeated.
I never was a busy man, hard work's not in my line, but there's a job or two about I couldn't well decline. Round at a great big brewer's place that isn't far from here, they pay a man a salary to taste their wine and beer. Now I wouldn't mind a job like that, I wouldn't mind the job. Tasting beer, it's my delight, I'd work overtime at night. If you hear of one, something in that style, send for me, and I'll go and do a month on trial. No, I wouldn't mind a job like that, I wouldn't mind the job. Tasting beer, it's my delight, I'd work overtime at night. If you hear of one, something in that style, send for me, and I'll go and do a month on trial. My brother, he was looking for a job both near and far, and now he is conductor on a Broadway cable car. He's just as honest as can be, and likes the job he's got. He's worked a month, got 8 a week, and bought a house